Okay, good.
Right.
Is the audio fine for everyone if I speak, or should I use my vocal mic? Carla, I see you. So if you can hear me, thumbs up.
It's a little quiet.
Okay. Then I'll do this one. I'll do the one there.
Okay.
Okay, is this a little bit better?
Yeah, that's better.
We made it. Hello, everyone. As you can tell, we're partially in person, which turns out we all forget how to do it now. We're Zoom pros and not in-person pros, but we figured it out. So today we have Irena Papst. She graduated from her PhD from McMaster University. She is now a postdoctoral fellow in their Department of Mathematics and Statistics, where she's working on mathematical modeling, especially of infectious disease dynamics. Sorry, the PhD is from Cornell Center of for Applied Mathematics. Some of the important interests that we all share are reproducible research, clear scientific communication, good teaching, always important, and big solids, why not? So please, Irena, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here because this is one of my favorite seminars. I hope that I will do it justice today. Thanks everyone for your patience as we try to do this hybrid thing. Just as a quick note, I do post my slides online because I tend to show a lot of pictures. And so if you want to take a little bit of time looking at those while I'm talking, you're welcome to follow along at home. And Leo actually put the link in the chat for everyone to make it easier because the slides are not clickable. So there's that. The audio is good though. We're doing okay here. Okay, excellent. So today I would unfortunately like to talk to you about COVID, which no one can escape, it seems like, especially not me. We are at a sort of point in the pandemic where there are sort of three phases. There's what's happened in the past, there's what's happening now, which is quite different from what's happened in the past. And then there's a question of what's going to happen in the future, which, you know, if anyone tells you they know, I think they're lying. So it's still a little bit uncertain. I will try to give you a little bit of optimism at the end of this because I think we are in a pretty good place right now, especially in Ontario and in Canada, but there are some things we could certainly work on. So just to get started, I do want to acknowledge, especially because I'm here in person and I'm very grateful, that the land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years had been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And I'm particularly grateful to have the opportunity to be here today and present for you on the land. So short-term forecasting of COVID-19 has sort of proven itself to be an enormously useful tool for public health planning throughout the pandemic. I don't think that's super controversial to say. And I'll just point out that lots of modeling has been used across Canada through the Public Health Agency of Canada and Dr. Teresa Tam, our Chief Medical Officer of Health, as well as in Ontario in particular. As you can see, there's been several cases where the modeling has sort of informed what we do as a province. And I'll actually just point out that this graph that Doug Ford is holding here includes some curves that my group made. So that's my 5 minutes of fame. That was a very fun press conference for me, although I have to say I wasn't super jazzed with the conclusions that were drawn from those projections, but that's another story for another day. So the projections that my group and I make, we do them for a couple of jurisdictions, but in particular, we have been sending them off to the Ontario Science Advisory Table, and they get sort of grouped in with a bunch of projections from a few other groups. And then we sort of decide what does the consensus seem to be from these independent models and independent assumptions. We try to get a better grasp of the picture because no one model is going to always be right. It's a matter of what do we think is happening kind of altogether. And so you might have seen these used in the news, or you might have looked at them yourself. But all of the forecasts that I'm going to show to you today have actually been submitted to the advisory table. Now, forecasting is quite difficult to do. And I actually was not super keen to get involved with COVID forecasting initially because it's so difficult. But, you know, I thought it was for a good cause. So I started getting involved, and usually it's pretty doable in the sense of you can create a decently good projection for the next couple of weeks. If you're trying to do a longer time horizon, it can be very difficult. But usually it's doable. And the reason I put usually in there is because right now, unfortunately, it's very, very hard. And I don't know how doable it is to be very precise about what's going to happen. So that's a little caveat that I'm not going to show you super new projections because I don't trust them very much. But let's look at an example of a better forecasting situation. So the forecast I'm going to show you is from around this time last year. And I don't know about you guys, but I've definitely forgotten what happened a year ago or 2 years ago. It's all sort of a blur for me. So I'm going to just quickly remind you what was happening in Ontario, because that's what the forecast is for. So in the lead up to the forecast date, which is marked here with this vertical line, these are infection reports. So these are actual infections that have been tested and reported through the Public Health Ontario or the Ministry of Health or whatever. They've gotten a PCR test, it's positive. This is certainly going to be an underestimate of actual infections, but those are cases that you usually see in the news. And while 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 cases in a province of 15 million may seem like a small amount, the problem is that we live in a place with a public healthcare system, which is very lean. And so when you looked at ICU occupancy at the same time, it was sort of rising steadily. Again, 400 people in the ICU, maybe it doesn't seem large to you if you haven't looked at the healthcare system, but just as a sort of anchor, our pre-COVID ICU capacity was only about 350 beds. And it's not just beds, it's actually more critically the staff that it takes for each ICU bed, which can be like 10 to 20 highly specialized people. So that was kind of our capacity in such a large province. And so while we did expand that capacity during the pandemic, we did it through pretty disruptive measures. Like we canceled elective surgeries, which sound optional, but actually can be life-saving down the line. And we've kind of continued to do these things as we've dealt with these surges. So basically we were worried about having a crisis in our hospitals at this time. And we wanted to figure out if we really needed to act or what the situation looked like on the ground. So in response to these rising infection reports and ICU occupancy, the government did do something. I mean, they implemented this lockdown in Toronto and Peel. Toronto and Peel are the two most populous health regions in Ontario. They're about a third of the population. So it's pretty significant. And then we even went for a province-wide shutdown on the 26th of December, conveniently right after Christmas. And then there was a stay-at-home order in January, because it seemed like things weren't really turning around very quickly, which isn't surprising because it does take a little bit of time for measures to get reflected in the data. But I wasn't complaining because I certainly thought we were in a bit of a pickle. So this was what was happening. And then thankfully, the combination of these interventions definitely began to help the situation get better. And we saw infection reports declining pretty steeply, which is beautiful. ICU occupancy took a little bit more time, but it was declining. It's not too surprising because ICU, by the time people get into the ICU versus when they got infected, there's a lag. And this is occupancy. This isn't like an individual case report. Once you get reported, you don't get tracked in the data anymore, right? Whereas ICU occupancy tracks your whole stay in the ICU. So not too surprising that that's not going down so quickly. Now, the stay-at-home order, at the point that we were getting ready to make this forecast, the stay-at-home order was about to expire in early March, and things were looking pretty good from this picture. And it definitely felt like the government did not want to extend it. And so the question we were asking was, okay, you may want to lift the stay-at-home order, but is it actually really safe if we're really thinking about the science? And just looking at this picture, you might definitely think, yeah, it should be totally safe to reopen. But there's another piece of the puzzle that we were very aware of that people may not have been aware of at the time, but certainly became aware, which is that we had received our first variant. So Alpha, which you might remember as B117, made its way into the province. And now why we were so concerned about this is because it had been in the UK about a month before it came to us. And it was wreaking a bit of havoc. It was 50% more transmissible than the other strains that were floating around at the time. And what was actually worked in our favor a little bit is that it made sort of confirmed landfall here on the same day that we went into our provincial shutdown. So it sort of came in during this period when we were really trying to lock down. And what I want to point out here is that these measures obviously created tremendous pressure on infection reports to come down. but it didn't exert the same kind of pressure on alpha. Alpha was still managing to take over more and more cases as a proportion of all cases, which is what it's plotted here. So that to us was kind of scary. And we had seen what it's done in the UK. And so we were worried that, you know, if we were going to make a forecast like we usually do without thinking about alpha's effect, you know, up to this point, it's not representing a ton of cases as a proportion. It's only up to 20% by the forecast date. So there isn't going to be a robust signal from alpha in the infection report data yet, but it certainly would probably play a factor in the forecast period. So we said, okay, we should probably take this guy seriously and include it in our model. So just to recap, while, you know, infection reports and ICU occupancy certainly favored reopening, alpha in our mind might threaten it. We wanted to see how that would balance out. And so we made a forecast. I'll talk a little bit more about how we make these forecasts, but this is infection reports. This is our model fit in black and the data in the points. And then these are the two projections we made. And the only difference here, it's the same model, except in this yellow curve that's taking off exponentially has the alpha variance effect baked in. Like we actually explicitly modeled it. Whereas this bottom curve here that does take off a little bit because we were modeling some change with reopening in transmission, doesn't take off a ton because it doesn't include this increased transmissibility of the variant that's coming in. And thankfully, because it's been some time, I can actually show you what happened. Turns out that if you didn't account for alpha, you would have been in trouble because you totally would not have gotten this exponential takeoff. Of course, our model, there are a couple of reasons why we didn't exactly hit the perfect sort of trajectory, which I won't get into because it'll take too long and I'll ramble. But the exponential takeoff qualitatively we captured, and we submitted this, the modeling table reported on it, the government didn't care, which is a little bit disappointing. And the only reason actually that we kind of this prophecy was fulfilled is because we did reopen. We didn't take this kind of projection seriously. And so it kind of, you know, things happened the way that we feared that they would happen. So the take home message here is that you can't always just look at the data that is kind of reliable and has been reliable, like just infection reports. You have to remember that these are flawed. They're an undercount of actual infections. They don't take into account when the epidemiological landscape is shifting, at least not in the early stages. And this is a lesson we've learned now for 3 variants. And it can be very hard to kind of keep on top of them because we basically, the only reason we were able to make this forecast is because the variant had established itself in the UK a month before us. And so we had all this data from them and all this analysis. Like Public Health England did an incredible job and continues to. And thankfully, we were able to use that to make these projections, but unfortunately, they weren't really acted upon. So now I've given you the sort of motivation, the exciting stuff. Let's talk a little bit about how we actually make these forecasts. I find a lot of people are interested, but it's really hard to explain what we're doing sometimes. So I'm going to try to do a good job here. So this is the big picture that I want you to keep in mind, basically. We start with data like infection report data, and we start with a model, which involves a lot of assumptions. I haven't shown you the model yet, but I'll get to that. And with this combination, we fit the model to the data through a process we call calibration or model fitting. And then once we have the fitted model, we can then decide what are our forecast scenarios in the period after the fitting period, make a lot of assumptions there, and then that together will generate the forecast. That's the really big picture. Let's dig into each piece a little bit more. So the data that we're fitting, as I've already teased, is the reported number of cases or infection reports in the province. And this definitely underestimates the number of infections, which is what our model really needs to understand transmission. So we have to make some assumptions there about how we're observing the data and what's actually what's the process behind it. And then there's also a delay of 1 to 2 weeks between when someone's actually infected and when they go to book their test, get swabbed, get the lab results back, et cetera. So there's a bit of a lag to be mindful of. And the other key thing that's actually really important right now, unfortunately, is that it also depends on testing availability. I mean, in the province, previously, we've kind of been lucky that if you're symptomatic, you can get a test. And now we're in a position where if you're in the general population and you're symptomatic, you may not be able to get a PCR test. You might just have to settle for a rapid. And then if you take a rapid, you're not reported in this data. So there's a bit of a surveillance issue that I'll get into later. But these data, you have to keep in mind, depend on the availability as well as behavior. Like Now that we have such wide availability of rapid tests, I'm sure that some people are testing positive on a rapid, even when they could get a PCR test, and probably didn't bother to go get a PCR test to confirm. Like, there's going to be some loss there too. So something to keep in mind. Doesn't mean the data is not useful, but it comes with a caveat. And I also mentioned that our model can actually fit and forecast hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths simultaneously when it's doing the fitting, which is very complicated statistically. But that was kind of the advantage of our model over others at the time. And it's coming in clutch a little bit now too, as our infection report data starts to get worse and we have to rely on other data streams. So we'll get into that a bit more later. That's the data. Now, what's the model? So this is a deep breath here. We're gonna do some math. So we use what we call a compartmental epidemiological model, which is based on an SEIR framework. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine. The idea is you take the whole population and you, at any point in time, you're in one of however many compartments. It depends on your disease state. And there are 4 main disease states, which is what SEIR stands for: susceptible, exposed, infected, or removed or recovered. So that kind of just basically sketches out the main process. Our model has more compartments because it's more complicated, but the focal ones are, you start as susceptible to the disease, you may be exposed, at which point you're actually infected, but you're not yet infectious. And then with COVID, there are kind of 4 main kinds of infections that we're interested in that have to do with your symptomatic status and then what could happen to you downstream. And then, of course, if we're going to make use of the hospitalization, ICU, death data, we need to include those as compartments. So we model kind of the healthcare system a little bit here. And then ideally you recover and you're good to go, or unfortunately you may die as well. So that's kind of the main gist. The most important for us in this talk is new infections, and therefore infection reports, which are based off of infections. Our forecast target infection reports is governed by transmission, and transmission occurs as the flow between susceptible and exposed. So this is really what we're trying to fit here accurately. If we're really only concerned with infection reports, we really don't care about these downstream outcomes so much. So this is kind of the thing that the pathway we're going to focus on. So let's really understand that right now. So our model for transmission, very simplified, is you take people from S, which are susceptible. There's some per capita rate, which we call the force of infection, that we multiply up by S to get the number of susceptibles that get moved into the exposed compartment at every time step. That's transmission, right? People are getting infected. Now, the force of infection, we model it. It's more complicated than I'm representing it, but the main idea here is there's some mysterious parameter beta, which is going to become our friend now. And then it's multiplied by this factor of I over N, where I is the number of infecteds over N, the total population size. Now, beta, we loosely call the transmission rate. Unfortunately, to interpret it, it's a little bit nuanced. The way I think it's clearest is to think about it as the number of transmission opportunities per individual per day. So that does depend on the contact rate. So you can kind of loosely think about it as a contact rate, like how many people am I bumping into every day on average? But then you also factor in that not every contact is a transmission opportunity. If we're both masked, we're not symptomatic necessarily, viral loads are low if one of us is sick, that may not actually be a valid transmission opportunity, right? So there's a bit of a fudge factor in there. But you can loosely think about it as kind of like, transmission opportunities or contact rate. And the I over N term is just a way of quantifying the probability that the person you actually bump into is sick. So this is using a very loose assumption of homogeneous mixing, which just means people are floating around kind of like atoms in an ideal gas, and they're bumping into each other, and maybe one gets infected, maybe one doesn't. It depends on what proportion of those atoms is infected or infectious, right? So that's what I over N models. So loosely, we're just taking some rate of transmission encounters and multiplying it by the probability that people are actually infected. Okay, so that's the model, very loosely speaking. And then we take the data, smush it with the model, and get a calibration. So we're fitting transmission, we're fitting that beta. That's the really key parameter. Now, this doesn't remain constant over time. I've written it as if it's a constant, but it's really not. And it changes for a couple of reasons. So for instance, if there are public health measures in effect, if there's mandatory masking here at U of T, if things are shut down, if there's a stay-at-home order, that's certainly going to affect transmission because it affects the contact rate, right? There's also population behavior. If I'm being super careful and being a hermit like I have been for like 2 years, certainly I'm not going to contribute a lot to transmission even if I'm sick, and I'm not going to be floating around susceptible. So that also comes into effect. There's also what's the mix of variants that's floating around me, right? Because we know not all variants are equally transmissible. As we heard, Alpha, for instance, was 50% more transmissible than other strains at the time. Delta was even more infectious. Omicron is like the most infectious pathogen that we know of. So unfortunately, these things aren't equal. And also it depends on vaccine coverage, because vaccines protect us to an extent from transmission. So all of these things go into beta, which means that we don't necessarily want to try to calibrate one constant beta for our model. So as a sort of, we're trying to make it a little more complicated without making the statistical fitting problem too hard. We basically just assume that beta is a function of t, but it's piecewise constant. So we kind of estimate it for constant for a little period, then we re-estimate in another period, and we get a function of time, but it's not super complicated. And how we choose when to re-estimate is when we think there's been a big change in public health measures or in population behavior. We might know that there's been a big change, like the stay-at-home order lifts. We may suspect the population starts acting differently because lots of people are vaccinated. So there's a bit of an art to picking those dates. But in general, I'll also say we don't actually think about variant introductions or vaccine coverage explicitly we don't think about fitting that through beta because we incorporate those effects explicitly in our model. And I won't talk about those expansions because it's not going to add much to the talk, but okay. So just as a visual picture, this is what I mean by we estimate the parameter as piecewise constant. So we might estimate it as, in this initial period, this is a toy example. It's, we have 0.5 transmission opportunities per susceptible per day. And then restrictions loosen, which bumps that up to 0.7 is what we estimate apparently with this graph. And then when restrictions tighten, it goes down. Now, for the forecast scenarios, it's actually based off of the same picture. So often what we do is we take these fitted betas and we make assumptions on what the beta for the forecast period is going to be. Sometimes we actually do we're modeling several interventions. We do several changes in beta and forecast in the forecast period. But generally the pattern is the following. You take the latest beta, this one here from the one that's like quantifying the last behavior that we've observed. And then in the forecast period, you either just use that latest beta, which I call a status quo forecast. Nothing has changed in the forecast period. Or you increase or decrease it by some percentage to get a sense of, like, relatively speaking, how much more or how much less transmission are we seeing? Okay, so that all worked really well for a long time. Unfortunately, Omicron just came here and said, like, no, guys, sorry, you got to start over. It's not that bad, but it's just Omicron has changed the social situation so much, and vaccines and all this other stuff, and the fact that we're 2 years into this thing, that we are facing challenges that we haven't faced before. So just to give you a recap of what's been happening in Ontario lately, when Omicron sort of started coming in the fall, we felt great. Like, I don't know about you guys, I was indoor dining, like it was wonderful. And we were lifting capacity limits. Not everyone, but a lot of people had 2 doses, like 90% of the population. We were not worried about hospitals filling up too much. But at the same time, we kind of got humbled a little bit. On the 24th of November, Omicron was first reported to the World Health Organization from scientists in South Africa. South Africa has unbelievable genomic surveillance of their variants, and that's why they were first reporting it. We think it actually didn't originate in South Africa. Unfortunately, there was a huge stigma associated with that finding, but we're very grateful to those scientists and to South Africa for alerting everyone. But what I'll point out is, it only took 4 days for us to find our own Omicron in Ontario. The first 2 cases that we found, there were first 2 cases in Canada. And so the key here is it was so fast, and that was a pattern we saw all over the world. Like, it just spread so incredibly quickly. And that was a big problem for us. So we went from this period of everything is beautiful, let's reopen, to, I don't know, guys, like maybe we should take a step back. And you can see this sharp takeoff here. Now, the points that I've colored red here on the end, I don't trust them. I don't think they're trustworthy. I don't think you should think that the trend is even representative here. More likely, I think we saw a massive exponential upshoot, and we just weren't able to observe it for a few reasons I'll get into in a second. And in response to not actually this data, in response to this data, the acute care occupancy, I don't know that I defined acute care occupancy. I'm sorry. It's hospitalizations that are not in the ICU. So it's everyone in a ward bed, everyone who, you know, doesn't need critical care, but needs hospital care. So in response to this pretty big spike in hospitalizations, we started to think, okay, we got to tighten the belt a bit. So we went back into what the government calls modified step 2. If you were to ask me what that means, I could not tell you. It's very confusing. You should just know that we were trying to close a bit. And then we didn't want to keep schools closed for very good reasons about, you know, how that affects kids. So we did reopen and parents. So we did reopen schools. And then the question was kind of at this point, which is from the next forecast I'll show you, you know, this modified step 2 thing expires on the 31st of January. Should we be concerned about that? Should we see if the government might want to extend that? What's going on? And so this is the focal question now. How safe was that 31st of January reopening? That's what we were trying to do a month and a half ago. Now, here's the thing. We had a lot of challenges, as I've teased several times, and I will finally tell you what they are. So Omicron surged very, very quickly around the world, and in a fashion that was sort of synchronized across jurisdictions that we often compare ourselves to. So yes, it's true that South Africa had their surge before us, but the South African population is very different epidemiologically from ours. They're on average much younger, on average have a lot more experience with COVID, a lot more natural immunity. They actually got hit with, I think, 1 or 2 other variants that we never had here. I think one was Beta, and that one had implications for, like, we weren't sure how protective, you know, our coverage here was from, you know, their Beta immunity that they had. They also didn't have as high of a vaccine uptake. So it made it very hard for us to understand what happened in South Africa, what that means for us in Ontario. And so we really didn't want to lean too heavily on their data and their analysis, because we didn't want to sort of delude ourselves into thinking that, you know, things would turn out the way they did there, which was on the whole not too bad. So we usually compare ourselves to places like the United Kingdom, like Denmark. We don't really compare ourselves to the United States so much, but, you know, it's a tempting comparison because they're so close. And I just want to point out, like, when you see this initial surge, this period that we were in, where we had the data from, because you can't get too close to the forecast date, because that data is kind of censored a little bit at the end there. There's like that delay that I was talking about. So, you know, when you look at this, you're like, well, no one has the data that we need. So we're just going to have to make a lot of assumptions here. And the problem with that is, even if we wanted to look within ourselves, our disease surveillance was severely limited at the end of December. And it's still very limited, which is the main thing I'm concerned about right now. If you look at the number of tests completed, this is PCR tests, positive or negative, just the number of processed tests, you can see we got close to our historic max. And this is actually close to our our lab capacity. But if you're just looking at this, you may think, well, I don't know if it's because we hit our capacity, we hit our supply threshold, or maybe, you know, people weren't really sick, and so the demand went down, and this is just a turnover that is related to the turnover of the epidemic curve. Of course, people who live in Ontario know probably what happened. If you look at test positivity, the percentage of tests that were actually positive out of the total tests, this we know from, you know, the past. Once test positivity hits like 10% or more ish, which is actually our historic max, you're not doing great. Like, you're actually missing more positives than you were before when you had lower test positivity. So when you fast forward here and you look at us almost hitting like 35, almost 40% positivity, you know that it was a supply issue of tests. It was not a demand issue. And anecdotally, I have several friends in the Toronto area who were sick, 100% had COVID. I think some of them actually had rapid, so they were able to test and rapid test positive. They could not get a PCR appointment for the life of them. And now, at the end of December, we changed the requirement so that if you're generally healthy and that you're not in a high risk group and you're symptomatic, you still can't get a PCR test. So lean on those rapids for sure. But that unfortunately means that we don't get the reported cases very accurately, which is why I don't trust those red points that I had plotted earlier. Okay. The other thing, so in order to compensate for this, we said, okay, forget infection reports after, let's say, the 15th of December. let's do the next best thing. Let's try to calibrate transmission from acute care occupancy. That's like one step removed from transmission. It's not as removed as deaths. It's not as removed as ICU. And it's a pretty decent data source. It actually has its own problems, which have been politicized in the sense of like, well, not every Omicron case in the hospital is really for Omicron. It's incidental. You might have heard incidental COVID admissions, right? That's like a thing that was going on. We compensated for that when we did this modeling because we didn't want to actually accidentally overestimate how many people really needed COVID care. Although I will argue, if you're in the hospital with COVID, it's much harder to treat you because you have to be isolated. So in terms of, strain on the healthcare system, it's still a problem, even if you're incidentally COVID positive, but that's a digression. So what we needed to do as we take a step removed from transmission into hospitalizations, we needed an expected severity of the disease. We need to know like what proportion of infections will actually be hospitalized. And that for a long time, we didn't know because like I said, we were in this synchronized surges. We couldn't use the South African severity data because their population's so different. So we actually, interestingly, ended up with an identifiability issue when we were fitting our model. So if you've taken stats and you've done, fitting stuff, you're probably like shaking right now. Like you're like, oh no, what do we do? Basically, we had two distinct cases of parameters that were very different epidemiologically, meant very different things for the forecast, but it led to essentially the same fit in the acute care occupancy data. So the next thing I'm going to show you is that fit and forecast, but I've put it in quotation marks because it's really not a forecast. Like we really don't know what's going on. It's very hard to say. This was from the 18th of January. So here is, this is acute care occupancy. The points are the data. The line is the model fit, the median, and then the bands are the 95% confidence intervals. And there are two worlds here, right? There's the high transmission, low severity world. So we had a lot of spread under the hood. But in general, it wasn't super severe. So we ended up with a number of hospitalizations. However, if you happen to calibrate in this other regime where you actually didn't have a ton of transmission, relatively speaking, but there was more severe cases because maybe it hit older populations first or whatever, or it's just more severe. We didn't know. There was, Omicron is mild was said a lot, but not a lot of people knew whether that was true, or no one really knew at the time. Now, which world you're in, it affects what's actually going on under the hood, right? So if you look at predicted infection reports from this model, this is in the world where we didn't have limited testing. If testing was kind of the same as it had been throughout the pandemic and you were able to get a test if you needed it, this is what infection reports would have looked like in each case. So high transmission, you can just see it like oodles of people getting sick. And then low transmission, not so many people got sick. And the reason this matters for the forecast is that this left world here had a ton of natural immunity built up in the population from how it happened. And so reopening would have looked much safer in this world here than it would have on the right, where we didn't actually have that much spread. So how much spread we had was a massive question. We still don't 100% know, but we have a bit of a better grasp on it. At the time, again, we didn't know which world we were living in. So we were trying to make these forecasts ahead of the 31st of January reopening to tell the government like, hey, this is what we think the science is saying. The government already had made its decision by the time we were doing this. And we were just kind of, at the end of the day, we are also providing a public service to people. And I think it's really important that when the science table gives its consensus forecast to the government, it gives the exact same information to the public. So there's no question of what the government had when it made its decisions. And so I think it's really important not only for the table to be advising the government, but it's great for people to be able to hold the government to account when they make decisions. So I wasn't totally depressed because I thought, okay, well, we did our jobs. We put the stuff out there and it is what it is. We're not making the decisions. But going forward, we were able to get a bit more information. Public Health Ontario did this phenomenal analysis of Omicron severity relative to Delta. And from that, we were able to sort of pin down which world we thought we were in more closely. So we definitely think that we were likely more closer to the higher transmission world, the one where there was more natural immunity built up, but we weren't exactly sure how much more. So when we made this forecast, we tried to pin severity down, but there was still a lot of unknowns. So this is for acute care occupancy. And the difference between the four scenarios is what happens with schools when they reopen, and then what happens with January 31st. It was too early to tell from the data because there just hadn't been enough time elapsed, especially for hospitalizations, which are lagged even more than infection reports. So these higher scenarios there, we were assuming that there was actually a small effect from school reopening, but it happened early enough that we were kind of at this point, this inflection point between maybe we'll take off, maybe we'll not. And even like a 5% increase in transmission at that time would have been enough to push us up. So we were kind of at this threshold area. And then the other two cases, it was, there wasn't an effect of, maybe there was a little effect from schools, but either there was an effect from schools, but there was no effect from further reopening, or there wasn't an effect of schools, but there also wasn't an effect of reopening. So what world did we end up in? Well, I'm very happy to say that we actually, luckily, it seems like schools and January 31st reopening did not cause too much chaos in hospitals at all, really. So does that necessarily mean, right? I was saying, if we have substantial immunity in the population, then reopening should be safer. Now, the converse does not necessarily apply, right? It's not an if and only if for my math people out there. Basically, it could be that we have a lot of natural immunity. It could be that people were not really ready to seize the day on the 31st of January and didn't really start to emerge from their COVID cocoons. It may also be that, those who are actually highest risk of perpetuating transmission chains had already gotten Omicron. So we had natural immunity in the population, but like strategically at these places where, we were getting people who were likely to spread a lot and they were immune. So that was kind of helping us out. That's definitely probably an effect, I think. It was also maybe potentially that our booster protection was better than we had anticipated in the model. So there's lots of moving parts, and it's really hard to take these forecast results. It's tempting to try to infer what's happened, but it's very dangerous to play that game. And you have to be a little bit more careful with your analyses when you're going back and trying to determine sort of the causal effects. Of course, everyone here knows this, I'm sure. Okay, so looking forward. Okay, so that's the past and the present. Now, I won't show you the real present because I don't think those forecasts are really ready for prime time yet. We're really working hard to make them good. But looking forward, the key here is that our goals as a society they're changing. Before we were really concerned with controlling spread. Now that so many people are protected from severe outcomes, not everyone, but a lot of people are, we're really careful. We're just trying not to overload our hospitals, right? I mean, that's always been a concern, but now it's really the primary concern. What I will say is that this mentality definitely leaves a lot of people behind, and not everyone can afford to take their chances, even if they're vaccinated, boosted. And we really should be doing what we can to protect everyone while recognizing the reality of living in this thing for the, potentially the third year now. And the other thing I want to warn everyone here is that even mild cases can lead to severe outcomes. Long COVID is not a joke. One of my friends got alpha in January, and he was a runner before, and he only started running again in the fall. Like, it was just, things like that happen. That's an anecdote. I understand the probabilities are much lower for, across the population, but it's something to be careful with. And there are actually 2 independent studies from this week that showed that there's actually evidence of, even for mild cases, premature brain aging, especially in the older populations, a higher risk of dementia and all sorts of other things. So, in terms of quality of life, those are a little bit scary, but if you really care about the healthcare system, these things are going to follow us, and we're going to have to continue to invest and build up our healthcare infrastructure to pay off the debt that we've kind of incurred through this pandemic. It's not just the immediate need, it's all the stuff that happens downstream from this crazy event that we've been living through. So unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people are done and think this is the best that we can do. I have a little bit of optimism for further vaccines that are not as fragile to variants. I think that that's something we're going to see, and we're seeing actually very promising results from nasally administered vaccines because of where they're delivering the vaccine and what kind of immune response you get from administering it in your nose versus intramuscularly. So I have a feeling we're not fully done with getting vaccinated, and I think it can only go up from here. We already have phenomenal vaccines, but I think it's going to get even better, and we're going to be even safer going forward. And I will acknowledge too, I understand this mentality. I don't blame anyone for thinking this way. I've thought this way several times, and you just have to kind of bring yourself back to, okay, what can I do still to help out? But, people will be taking more risks. We will be lifting restrictions. We'll reduce testing requirements in terms of travel, for instance. If you happen to be in a workplace that does some regular testing, you may not have to do that anymore. And these are all things to keep in mind. But what's also really important to keep in mind is that this disease is not just going to disappear. Like, this is not some fantasy land where suddenly the pathogen is gone. It's all over the world, and it's highly transmissible in the current form that we're dealing with. And I'll remind you, H1N1, which was the pathogen that caused the 1918 influenza epidemic or pandemic. HIV caused a massive pandemic for decades, still going on. Avian flu caused one or two pandemics, I think. They didn't disappear. They're still around. They're just much less of a threat, but we still occasionally have these outbreaks from them. And so I think the message here is we still have to plan for occasional COVID outbreaks. I know everyone is done, but we have to set ourselves up for success. One idea is to be open to having these temporary masking and testing advisories, maybe, during certain seasons, if this becomes a seasonal disease, which it's looking likely, we now just mask, or, the public health, Toronto Public Health tells you, okay, please mask when you're on public transit during this month or something. Those are not difficult interventions in the sense of it's not hard to do. And, testing as well, if you're, if there's a local outbreak, maybe on campus, distributing free rapid tests and getting people to test themselves on a specific day is a great way to start interrupting those transmission chains. But the key here is you have to get masks, good masks, and tests into people's hands before these things happen, right? Distributing these things freely to people to have in their medicine cabinets when, we decide we need to pull the trigger for them is key, right? So we're less reactive, we're more proactive. And what's really important too is to normalize these really easy protective behaviors once you equip people to do them, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily easy to buy a mask if you don't have the finances for that, but if you're given a mask, it's not hard to put it on your face, right? Necessarily. So, normalizing masking in public spaces, especially in COVID season, if that becomes a thing. In East Asia, people routinely mask during influenza season on transit, in shops or whatever. That's just normal. We need to make those things normal here too, because they're easy and they're good interventions. Same with rapid testing. If you're planning a wedding with 200 people during COVID season, send everyone a test. Include that with your save the dates or invitations. And then ask everyone to test the day before or right before coming. Just make it really easy for people. We don't need one big solution. We need a lot of little solutions, I think, to kind of plan ahead. And the key to all of this, to be able to do these sort of proactive measures, you can't take your eyes off the situation. Don't give up on surveillance. Obviously, it seems like there's not an appetite to continue the PCR testing that's freely available. Not so much anymore, right? But there are other ways that we can surveil the population that are a little bit slicker and still pretty good for, keeping eyes on outbreaks. One that you might have heard of from, the news, because everyone made a big deal about this about a month ago when infection reports were awful, is wastewater testing. Now, there's a certain deal of viral shedding that goes into our wastewater. Everyone thinks it's poop, but I'm pretty sure I heard it's most likely saliva when you're brushing your teeth and stuff. But that's someone can fact check me on that. But so wastewater, there's a bunch of viral, pieces of the viral genome in there that they can find and detect at certain levels and whatever. There's some issues with that data, but on the whole, it's really good at finding changes in spread. So if there's an uptick or if there's a decrease, which is perfect for us when we're thinking about planning for these occasional outbreaks. It's not so good for trying to infer the number of infections. That's a really hard problem because not everyone sheds the same rate. Depends on the kind of infection you have. If you're just asymptomatic or severely symptomatic, that'll affect how much you're shedding, if you're vaccinated or not. And we don't know, we don't necessarily know exactly who's shedding. And so it gets a little bit complicated. It's not impossible, but that's not the best use of this data. Another thing we can do is have these routine workplace testing programs, whether it's PCR or rapid, in high-risk settings. We do that already in long-term care homes. In daycares, for example, that'll be really important, I think, because kids under 5 are not vaccinated yet. I'm hoping that 6 months to 4 years or whatever vaccine comes out soon. But until then, those are high-risk settings because the unvaccinated spread the most. So we definitely want to try to contain those. Having these routine testing programs that are independent of symptoms is really important. And there are a couple success stories that I can expand on that I know of where that's really kept things safe. And lastly, there are these sentinel surveillance programs, which are basically you recruit people into a study, like you try to randomize across geography, race, socioeconomic status, et cetera, and you enroll them in the study, and then you just literally come to the door and swab them. Like you make it super easy for people. And they do this in the UK. They have the biggest study that I know of like this. It's wonderful. It's called the REACT study. And they every month test 150,000 people across these axes. So that gives an incredibly good picture that is much less biased than when you get people in for testing for symptoms. So we can do these things. We just aren't doing them yet exactly. In some capacity, we're doing, these wastewater and workplace testing, but we could definitely do a better job. So what I want to leave you with is, everyone's talking about living with COVID, right? That's the phase that we're in. Everyone wants to live with COVID, but I'll say, I don't think people want to live with COVID. I think they want to live despite it. And I think we have to be very careful because those are two very different things. If we want to set ourselves up for success, we have to figure out how to plan to live with it and not just live even though it's around us. With that, I will say thank you to my collaborators who are wonderful. So David, Jonathan, and Ben are all professors at McMaster. Evan is a postdoc. Mike, who is so key to this process of forecasting, who just works himself to the bone to do this for PHAC, Public Health Agency of Canada, for not just Ontario, but many provinces. So key, I really want to shout him out. And Steve is a data scientist with the new Canadian modeling network, CanMod, who's helped us speed up our code so much, and it's been very helpful. And speaking of code, all of the code that we actually use is publicly available. There's a GitHub package, there's an R package that's on GitHub that if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can look at. And I'll say too, that when we do make these forecasts for the science table, we occasionally, when it's an important forecast, we write a blog post about it and just get into more detail. If you're interested in those, you can find them here at the MacTheoBio homepage. You can Google that later if you want. And I will thank everyone for listening, for rambling about COVID for an hour or so. Thank you. Oh, getting like live applause feels great, as well as digital applause.
Oh my goodness. I don't even know what to say. That was absolutely incredible. Okay, so when I think about science communication from now on, your face is gonna come.
Oh my God.
That was, we need to get you in front of Doug Ford.
Oh my God.
Yesterday.
Don't do that. I wrote a really important letter once. I don't think we're on good terms. It was actually about those graphs that you got up. Misrepresented in my mind. That's
Thank you so much. We have our first question as usual. And then we'll stop recording. So people please add in your questions. What are some books you recommend everyone read?
Oh my God. Okay. I got really big into behavioral economics a couple of years ago. I think a lot of people go through this phase. And yeah, Rohan's laughing. So I really, I often think about Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, is it? Which is a wonderful book basically about helping you help yourself, acknowledging that people don't really change their behaviors because they have the will to, but rather because they're nudged to by some negative or positive outcome. Often it's negative. And if you want to sort of, change your behavior, you have to acknowledge that you have to make it easy for yourself to change your behavior. So one really good example, for instance, is, and I do this actually, in my pantry cupboard, the snacks that are very easily accessible are snacks that are probably better for me than the ones that are not. The ones that are not, I have to get on a chair to get, which is fine. I'm not keeping them for myself, but they're not really within reach. So when I'm hungry and I'm not thinking with my not the lizard brain, what's the other one? There's the lizard brain and then there's the human brain. I don't know. When I'm not thinking with my human brain, I will not necessarily grab like whatever unhealthy snack I have in my house. So Nudge is a great one. Oh my God, I should have known this question was coming. I'm so upset at myself for not. There's a really nice fiction book called The Midnight Library that was kind of bigger last year. And it is a lovely, I would be a little bit careful with it because it does deal with suicide, but it is just such a lovely it gives you a beautiful perspective about life and death that I hadn't encountered before. So I would certainly recommend that one. What else have I read? Oh, I've been really big into Louise Penny books lately. She's a Canadian mystery fiction author. She lives in Quebec, and she often writes about a small town in Quebec, and it's just very quaint and warm. It's like a cozy little mystery. So yeah, I think those are my three different kinds of books that I would recommend.